Hello, my fellow sinners. Welcome to alphacenturian. I'll be your guide. You can know this is a serious video because I took down the majority of the figurines behind me. Before we begin, my argument in this video and what I intend to prove with my reading of these select verses is that the Old Testament books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy do indeed endorse the ancient Near East and Middle Eastern, that is Mesopotamian, institution of slavery. However, it is paramount to my approach to first view these texts as historical legal codes, embracing their ancient legal context, and then to regard them as literature and narrative, well before trying to interpret them as infallible, inspired text, which would necessitate hermeneutical reconciliation with the theological and metaphysical teachings of Christ Jesus. Failure to adopt this method and formula risks distorting the essence and meaning of the word, consequently missing the profound analogy accessible only through Christ Jesus, our Lord and Master, who took the form of a slave, and whose burden is light, whom sacrificed himself for our sins, thereby redeeming us, whitewashing and waving away the genuine portrayal of slavery in the Old Testament, severs crucial theological links to the nature of Christ's sacrifice. Notably, I must acknowledge the CSB Holman Bible and the ESV Crossway Bible, both of which I consulted during this research endeavor. While the study editions of these two Bibles provided substantial insights, many other study Bibles and Bible commentaries provided only scarcity and silence in their coverage of these passages. The ESV, though comprehensive, omitted two critical selections, while the CSB leaned toward apologetics, rendering it unsuitable for this project. The silence of certain Bible commentaries, particularly the Ignatius Press Bible commentaries, left a striking and disappointing void in the scholarship and research available for this video. The objective of this video revolves around a meticulous examination of slavery in the Bible, primarily within the key text of Exodus 21, Leviticus 19, Leviticus 22, and Leviticus 25, Numbers 31, and Deuteronomy 15, Deuteronomy 20, and Deuteronomy 23. This undertaking aspires to unearth the truth buried by apologetical rhetoric, and to contemplate that truth's true significance. That means rejecting the whitewashing so many do when approaching these verses, focusing instead on confronting the stark, brutal, and harsh realities of slavery in the ancient world. The goal is to understand what the Bible is communicating about slavery in the context of its historical era, and to gain insights into the implications of these laws for contemporary Jewish and Christian communities that hold these laws with reverence. And I include myself in that category. I will list the resources I used for my research at the end of this video. Let's begin. Let's begin with Exodus 21, 1 through 11. These are the ordinances you shall lay before them when you purchase a Hebrew slave. He is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall leave as a free person, without any payment. If he comes into service alone, he shall leave alone. If he comes with a wife, his wife shall leave with him. But if his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children belong to her master, and the man shall leave alone. If, however, the slave declares, I love my master and my wife and children, I will not leave as a free person. His master shall bring him to God, and there, at the door or doorpost, he shall pierce his ear with an awl, thus keeping him as his slave forever. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go free as male slaves do. But if she displeases her master, who had designated her for himself, he shall let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has broken faith with her. If he designates her for his son, he shall treat her according to the ordinance for daughters. If he takes another wife, he shall not withhold her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. If he does not do these three things for her, she may leave without cost, without any payments. There are plenty of apologists who try to downplay the brutal, misogynistic words that were just said. They will say, oh, look at how much freedom and how much liberty it's granting at a time when freedom wasn't granted to other people. They'll say stuff like, this is the first society to include protection for women. Look, it protected the wife of the Israelite slave. Look, it protects the right of an Israelite-born woman. It does not protect the rights of the slave of conquest. It does not protect the rights of the foreigner or the alien, the resident alien who's a slave. And it definitely does not protect the rights of the woman who bears a child just because she is a foreign-born woman or a child of a foreign-born woman. And she is bedded, not by her choice, by the Israelite slave. I know that people try to work around that, but to work around that is to deny what it is saying. All right, let's continue. Chapter 21, verse 20 through 21. By the way, I'm using the NAB. When someone strikes his male or female slave with a rod, so that the slave dies under his hand, the act shall certainly be avenged. If, however, the slave survives for a day or two, he is not to be punished, since the slave is his own property. You heard that correct. The slave is the property of his master, and therefore the master can discipline as he sees fit. And as long as that discipline doesn't kill him in the first day, well, then it's justified. The Hammurabi Code sets in rules for how to treat slaves and for when to free them. It's actually every 3 years, not 7. To say this is the first society to do this is not factual. It reminds me of when Islamic apologists try to use the line about how to beat your wife properly as a way to show that it is somehow a feminist treatise to protect women's rights. This is the same nonsense when an apologist does that with the Bible. It is saying it is okay to beat your slave as long as you don't kill him. That's what it's saying. To make it say otherwise is to twist the meaning of the words and therefore to lie. By the way, the term slave and slave means something a little different here. An Israelite slave is really more of a servant, because an Israelite can only be a slave of God. See, what's missed in a lot of this is that God didn't free the slaves of Israel to let them be, to give them libertarian freedom. He freed them from Israelite servitude to be slaves of God in his land, Canaan. They are to be servants to the Lord alone. Therefore, they cannot be a servant to another man. Hence, if they choose the foreign wife that they lived with for 7 years, the maid servant, as being more important than the freedom granted to them by God, they are punished by being pierced through the ear in front of other people, in front of the judges. They're punished. It's a punishment for choosing a foreign slave woman and choosing servitude over the freedom promised by God. I know it's harsh, but it's what it says. It is what it is. Chapter 21, verse 26 through 27. When someone strikes his male or female slave in the eye and destroys the use of the eye, he shall let the slave go free in compensation for the eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his male or female slave, he shall let the slave go free in compensation for the tooth. So while a Jewish servant gets manumission every 7 years, at least a male Jewish servant, for a slave who is not an Israelite to be free, their only means of freedom are dismemberment or death. I know that sounds pretty brutal, but let's move on to Leviticus. Leviticus 19:20 through 22. If a man has sexual relations with a female slave who has been acquired by another man, but has not yet been redeemed or given her freedom, an investigation shall be made. They shall not be put to death, because she has not been freed. The man shall bring to the entrance of the tent of meeting, as his reparation to the Lord, a ram as a reparation offering. With the ram of the reparation offering, the priest shall make atonement before the Lord for the wrong the man has committed, so that he will be forgiven for the wrong he has committed. I want to be very clear here. The wrong that was committed was not against the woman. The wrong that was committed was against God. There is nothing sacred about the slave woman, for she is property. That's harsh. Okay, let's go to Leviticus 22, verse 10 and 11. Neither an unauthorized person, nor a priest tenant or laborer may eat of any sacred offering, but a slave whom a priest acquires by purchase, or who is born in his house, may eat his food. You might say, well, I just read a bunch of brutal stuff. Look how far this is going. Even the slave has to eat their master's food. But this is a good thing. See, here we get to a metaphor in the Christian world for the Eucharist. See, you are a slave to sin. You are a slave to your body. You're a slave to your nature. But the meal, the Holy Eucharist, the Thanksgiving meal, is a closed offering. Only for priests, only for the royal priesthood, only for the familyhood of the priest. But it's saying that even the slave is part of the family and can eat the priest's food. We went from Exodus, where the laws are first issued, to Leviticus. We've changed authors. I know that's going to hurt some people's feelings who want to believe that Moses wrote all of this. But we changed authors and we changed perspectives. Notice that each perspective is going to be a little less harsh. We went from a narrative to more legal code. And when we started getting into what's written by the priests, what's written by the authors of the Holy Code, the Holiness School, when we get into this kind of stuff, we will see that different perspectives will come out and come into play. Let's get to Leviticus 25, verses 39 through 55. When your kindred with you, having been so reduced to poverty, sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. Rather, let them be like laborers, or like your tenants, working with you until the Jubilee year, when together with any children they shall be redeemed. They shall be released from your service and return to their family and to their ancestral property, since they are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not sell themselves as slaves are sold. Do not lord it over them harshly, but stand in fear of your God. The male and female slave that you possess, these you shall acquire from nations around you. You may also acquire them from among the resident aliens who reside with you, and from their families who are with you, those whom they bore in your land. These you may possess and bequeath to your children as their hereditary possession forever. You may treat them as slaves, but none of you shall lord it harshly over any of your fellow Israelites. When your kindred, having been so reduced to poverty, sell themselves to a resident alien who has become wealthy, or to descendants of a resident alien's family, even after having sold themselves, they still may be redeemed by one of their kindred, by an uncle or cousin, or by some other relative from their family. Or having acquired the means, they may pay the redemption price themselves. With the purchaser, they shall compute the years from the sale to the Jubilee, distributing the sale price over these years as though they had been hired as laborers. The more years they are, the more of the sale price they shall pay back as the redemption price. The fewer the years they are before the Jubilee year, the more they have as credit. In proportion to the years of service, they shall pay the redemption price. The tenant alien shall treat those who sold themselves as laborers, hired on an annual basis, and the alien shall not lord it over them harshly before your very eyes. And if they are not redeemed by these means, they shall nevertheless be released, together with any children, in the Jubilee year. For the Israelites belong to me as servants. They are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I, the Lord, your God. Now, there are a lot of apologists who will take these verses, only read them partially, and then say, see, you were overstating the fact, or you misunderstood what was going on in Exodus. You see, it is about freedom. Look at how it limits the harshness. It only limits the harshness on the Israelites, who, even if they sell themselves into servitude, should not be considered as slaves because they are slaves of God. When you read the law codes of the Hittites, when you read the Hammurabi Code, or when you look at other law codes from around this time period, and by around this time period, it's very broad because different periods come and go during this era of history. But when you look at how slaves were treated in the ancient world, the quote-unquote uniqueness is not here. At least not yet. Let's keep going. Let's get to Numbers 31, 9 through 18. But the Israelites took captive the women of the Midianites with their children and all their herds and flocks and wealth as loot, while they set on fire all the towns where they had settled and all their encampments. Then they took all the plunder with the people and animals they had captured and brought the captives together with the spoils and plunder to Moses and Eleazar, the priest, and to the Israelite community at their camp on the plains of Moab, by the Jordan opposite Jericho. When Moses and Eleazar, the priest, with all the leaders of the community, went outside the camp to meet them, Moses became angry with the officers of the army, the commanders of thousands and the commanders of hundreds, who were returning from the military campaign. So you have spared all the women, he exclaimed. These are the very ones on Balaam's advice, were behind the Israelites' unfaithfulness to the Lord in the affair at Peor. So that plague struck the Lord's community. Now kill therefore every male among the children, and kill every woman who has had sexual relations with a man. But you may spare for yourselves all the girls who have not had sexual relations. Wow, right? Okay. So first off, this is going to be wartime law. This is what's going to be examined here. Secondly, this is propaganda. It's not real. It's not real history. I know. It sounded bad, right? The people were not wiped out. They're actually in the very next chapter. So why is it there? What's going on there? Well, it's there in a spiritual sense to teach that absolute obedience to God, to the Lord, is demanded by faith. That if you're going to live by faith, you must obey the Lord completely. It's also there as a warning that there is a balance between, and this is a very old quote here, between loving the sinner and hating the sin. And sometimes your compassion can get the better of you. And while you think you're showing mercy, you're actually loving the sin and hating the sinner, or maybe even ignoring the sinner. Your compassion is no longer for the sinner themselves. Your love is no longer for the sinner themselves, but it's for the sin. That's the warning. Don't let your compassion get the better of you. Keep it in check. Remember that you're supposed to be merciful to the sinner, not to the sin. So all those lessons are there, but you still have to go, well, yeah, but I mean, look at what it's saying. Okay? Yeah, it's harsh. But if we go back to Exodus and if we go back to Leviticus, the way that the Jewish people were able to get slaves was through conquest. And that's what that's an example of historically. Even if it's not historically accurate, even if it is propaganda, it reflects the real history that that is how they got their slaves, was through conquest. And then you're saying, well, yeah, but they only took the women and they only took the girls on top of that. Like, that's really gross, really weird, really terrible. Yes, it is. It's also the practice of ancient people in warfare across cultures. That was the world they lived in. And while this may be propaganda and not reflect real history or real wartime policy, it does reflect a broader reality of the brutalness of the ancient world. A brutalness that is not that far away from our world. This type of brutality still exists today. It's important to remember that. Deuteronomy 15, 1 through 6. At the end of every 7-year period, you shall have a remission of debts. And this is the manner of the remission. Creditors shall remit their claims on the loans made to a neighbor, not pressing the neighbor, one who is kin, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed. You may press a foreigner, but you shall remit the claim on what your kin owes to you. However, since the Lord your God will bless you abundantly in the land of the Lord your God, will give you to possess as a heritage, there shall be no one of you in need. If you but listen to the voice of the Lord your God and carefully observe his entire commandment, which I enjoin on you today, since the Lord your God will bless you as he promised, you will lend to many nations and borrow from none. You will rule over many nations, and none will rule over you. Now, there's an important idea that comes from Origen when he talks about when the Bible is showing you that it's not being literal. This is an idealistic and utopian set of laws. They're actually going back and changing the law code here. Now, there are several different theories on how and why. The one that I like the best, the one that I found most entertaining, which probably means it's the least likely to be true, but I still found it entertaining, was that the king seeing the inevitability of the Babylonian conquest, to try to appease the Lord, knowing that the people had not been following the spirit of the law from Exodus, from Leviticus, and from Numbers, decided to make the law more clear, that you had to free both the man and the woman, that you had to give a gift to the people who you freed so that way they weren't starving. But it still didn't help the foreigners, as you just heard. Foreign people were still oppressed, were still seen as less than. And in the end, this revolutionary change was for nothing. This move to try to appease God in the last minute didn't work. The Babylonians still conquered, still destroyed. Too little, too late. But the law, the change in the law held. And it did eventually go into effect. In the Second Temple period, these idealistic laws would have been the law of the land, but not before. Let's get to Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 12 through 18. If your kin, a Hebrew man or woman, sells himself or herself to you, he or she is to serve you for 6 years. But in the 7th year, you shall release him or her as a free person. When you release a male from your service as a free person, you shall not send him away empty-handed, but shall weigh him down with gifts from your flock and threshing floor and winepress. As the Lord your God has blessed you, so you shall give to him. For remember that you too were slaves in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. That is why I am giving you this command today. But if he says to you, I do not wish to leave you, because he loves you and your household, since he is well off with you, you shall take an awl and put it through his ear into the door, and he shall be your slave forever. Your female slave also you shall treat in the same way. You shall not be reluctant when you let them go free, since the service they have given you for 6 years was worth twice a hired laborer's salary. And the Lord, your God, will bless you in everything you do. Again, these are utopian, idealistic laws. These are not reflective of the actual changes at that time. To understand this, you just have to look at Amos, at Job, at Jeremiah. These books speak on how they view the reasoning of the punishment that came to the Jewish people, that came to the Israelites, the Hebrews, as being a consequence of them not honoring these laws, that they were too harsh with their slaves, that they did end up treating their fellow Israelite people as slaves, that they treated the chain gangs and the work gangs who were foreign conquest and the resident alien and the foreigner among them, they treated them poorly. And because of that, God punished them by letting a foreign land, by letting a foreign nation conquer them. Just important context. So don't let an apologist try to fool you into thinking that this means that that change happened at that time. The other theory, which is not as bombastic, but is more reasonable, is that since these laws were written later, the reason for these apparent contradictions, the reason for these inconsistencies within the law, as it is reported to us, is that they reflect different traditions. These different traditions, the reason why both or sometimes all three or however many are kept, even though they seem to contradict, is that the scribe or the redactor or the editor was trying to preserve the most ancient version of that oral tradition. And if they didn't know which one was which, they just recorded all three, or however many traditions they knew of. Conversely, they might have kept the one they knew was older, even though they knew it contradicted the one that they knew was newer. Again, to preserve the oldest form of that oral tradition. All right, let's continue on. That was 15. Okay, now let's go to chapter 20, verses 10 through 18. When you draw near a city to attack it, offer it terms of peace. If it agrees to your terms of peace and lets you in, all the people to be found in it shall serve you in forced labor. But if it refuses to make peace with you, and instead joins battle with you, lay siege to it. And when the Lord your God delivers it into your power, put every male in it to the sword, but the women and children and livestock, and anything else in the city, all its spoil, you may take as plunder for yourselves, and you may enjoy this spoil of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given you. This is how you shall deal with any city at a considerable distance from you, which does not belong to these nations here, but in the cities of these people that the Lord your God is giving you as a heritage. You shall not leave a single soul alive. You must put them all under the ban: the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, just as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that they do not teach you to do all the abominations that they do for their gods, and you thus sin against the Lord. I know that sounds bad, but remember, this is written after the fact. These people already still exist inside these societies. What this is actually justification for the mistreatment that they have later on in these societies. And it's also a way of saying that to the reader, don't mix with these groups, even though we may share a common ancestor. They're bad people, and if you mix with them, you'll be under the ban. You won't be a Jewish person anymore. You'll lose your cultural identity. You'll die to us. This can be reflected in the story of the prodigal son. That's what this is talking about. In fact, a lot of this are reflected in the prodigal son. So when you read that story, think of these rules. Think of what these rules are teaching that is reflected and brought out in the story of the prodigal son. Finally, the last one for today is going to be chapter 23, verses 15 through 16. Since the Lord, your God, journeys along in the midst of your camp to deliver you and to give your enemies over to you, your camp must be holy, so that he does not see anything indecent in your midst and turn away from you. You shall not hand over to their master any slaves who have taken refuge with you from their master. Let them live among you in any place they choose, in any one of your communities. That seems good to them. Do not oppress them. That sounds very progressive, right? And apologists will use that to say, look, it abrogates everything earlier. It's written in a way to get those tribes that they're conquering to agree with them, to submit to them, to make peace with them. I believe this is actually directed toward the Hittites. And the Hittites had the opposite rule, which was that any bounty hunter who captures an escaped slave would be richly rewarded, and the escaped slave would be immediately killed. So it's actually a way to try to get the other side to join you. Now, this might have been toward the Amorites or the Moabites or to whatever group, but that's what this is, a gesture. It's not necessarily reflective of the actual reality on the ground. Now, I don't want to leave on a sour note, so I do want to say one more thing before I go through my sources. And that's Jesus comes to redeem the Jewish people and the Gentiles, the freeborn and the slave, the master and the slave. He redeems all, and he makes them all equal in love. Understand that the way Christianity solves these issues is going to be different than the way that Judaism solves these issues. but the rabbis do acknowledge these problems and do have solutions in their writings. There's going to be explanations here, and they're going to soften the interpretation because of the actual reality on the ground. And this is something that really needs to be hit hard before I move on. For the Christian, all this is redeemed through Christ, because Christ is God incarnate and the Word of the Lord, and the Son of Christ, the Prince, the King's Son, took the form of a slave and then sacrificed himself to redeem us. The same redemption that you get as a slave to become free, to become one of God's chosen people. That redemption is part of this slave metaphor, this analogy that gets presented and drawn out through these chapters, through these books, through these passages. So that's all very important. But there's one other thing. Just because it's a law in this book doesn't mean it was a law that was actually practiced or that was actually exercised at the level of stringentness that is expressed in the book. There can be a law that says you don't wear a hat in a bar and you still wear a hat in a bar. It doesn't mean that it's followed. It doesn't mean that law is followed. Everybody knows someone who speeds all the time, and depending on the city you're in, depending on the street that you're on, that law is either highly enforced or very loosely enforced, even though it is still a speeding law. Same thing here. Not all of these laws were enforced. In fact, some of them were not enforceable. And so because they were unenforceable, you actually would have to have appeals to conscience, as you heard in some of these passages, because there was no judge or police or judicial system to enforce this particular type or this particular law. Later on in Jewish history, there may have been some type of remedy, and in Roman times there may be some kind of remedy, but in the times that this is being written, there's no one there to physically enforce the law. So how is the law enforced? How do we know that they're doing this or that? Well, again, you read some of the prophets and you'll see that they weren't following the laws and they weren't enforced, good or bad. Okay, let's go over my sources real quick, my resources here, just so that you can see what I read. We'll go from there. So the resources for this video, what I studied for my notes, is going to be the Oxford Catholic Study Bible, 3rd edition, NABRE, the Word on Fire Bible, the Pentateuch, NRSV, the Oxford Jewish Study Bible, the Art Scroll Chumash, the Orthodox Study Bible, NKJV, the New Oxford Annotated Bible, 5th edition, NRSV, and the HarperCollins Study Bible, NRSV. There you go. Those are my resources. So if you want to know what I read, go to these same chapters, read the notes on the bottom, and you can read what I read and you can get the same information. I hope this was interesting to you all. This is very long. I hope you all like it. I hope someone watches this. Please like and subscribe. Comment down below. Please respond to this. There we go.